Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The wind moved across the high plains like a restless spirit, rolling over the dry grass and whispering across the rocks scattered along the foothills of the Dano Estacado. Winter had settled early that year, harder and sharper than the last. A layer of frost clung to the earth each dawn, while the sun remained a pale disk that offered little warmth. Far from the nearest settlement, miles beyond any traveled trail, a lone cabin stood at the edge of a weather-beaten ridge. It had survived hail, windstorms, and the relentless passage of time. Its creaking frame was the only witness to the life of the solitary man who had called it home for 9 years. The man was known among the few ranchers who still passed through the region as Elijah Crow, a middle-aged cowboy with a past lined with silence and shadows. He had once been part of a cattle outfit, the kind that pushed long drives north and left legends behind them. But somewhere along the road, his own legend turned inward and disappeared into the wilderness. Those who spoke of him described a man who had withdrawn from the world the way a wounded animal retreats into darkness. He had arrived in the isolated valley with nothing but a horse, a saddlebag, and a gaze that looked as if it had stared down more winters than a man should. In the first years, his days followed a strict rhythm forged from necessity. With no cattle to tend, he hunted enough to survive, trapped small game, chopped wood, repaired the cabin, and kept his tools sharp. Over time, the routines became less about survival and more about habit. As if repetition were the only way he could keep his thoughts from drifting back to whatever drove him into solitude. The nights were the worst. They stretched too long and too quiet, and the cold pressed in from every side. But Elijah grew used to the silence, even came to rely on it, until it became the only companion he trusted. The 9th winter was harsher than any he had endured. Snow arrived early and did not melt between storms. The creek froze after the first deep freeze, turning water, fetching into a daily struggle. Firewood ran low quicker than expected, and hunting became sparse as most animals either migrated or burrowed deep into the earth. Elijah had weathered difficulties before, but age had begun to settle in his bones like another layer of ice. His body stiffened in the cold, and his hands numbed faster each day, though he never voiced complaint, even to himself. He was a man shaped by endurance, but endurance has limits no matter how stubbornly one pretends otherwise. One evening, as another storm approached, he returned to his cabin with the last bundle of wood he could carry. Snow clouds blotted out the horizon, building into a heavy sky that seemed ready to crush the land beneath it. The air felt still in the way it does before a violent blizzard, and even the crows had fallen silent. Elijah built a fire, fed his horse, and ate a meager supper. When the winds began to howl against the cabin walls, he settled in for what he expected to be another long night, filled with nothing but crackling flames and the occasional creak of timber shifting. Under the storm's weight, time passed without measure. The storm thickened, roaring through the valley with a force that rattled the shutters. Snow slammed against the cabin, piling high at the base of the door. Elijah sat close to the flames, keeping an eye on them, as he always did when weather threatened. A man living alone learns early that fire is both friend and danger. Let it burn too low, and the cold steals in. Let it burn too high, and the cabin itself becomes a pyre. It was nearly midnight when he first sensed something amiss. It wasn't a sound at first, but a shift in the rhythm of the storm, a faint irregularity, a presence. Something moving against the wind instead of being pushed by it. He dismissed it as imagination, but soon another sound followed, something too deliberate to be the storm. A soft thud against the door, then another, not heavy enough to be a bear, not wild enough to be debris. Something else. For a brief moment he thought of memories he spent years burying, the riders he once encountered, the enemies made long ago, the dangers a man never fully leaves behind. But instinct sharpened, and he reached for the rifle resting against the hearth. He moved slowly, quietly, listening. The thud came again, weaker this time, not a threat, not someone trying to break in. This was something collapsing, not forcing entry. Something or someone seeking shelter. Elijah eased toward the door, each step calculated. Snow blew in through the edges of the boards, carrying bitter cold into the room. When he unbarred the door and cracked it open, a gust of wind slammed into him, nearly putting out the fire behind him. But in that violent rush he saw her, a woman lying half, buried in snow, her body trembling, her skin pale under the moonlit storm clouds. Her clothing told him everything he needed to know. She was Comanche, the beadwork, the leather, the distinct patterns stitched into her winter garments. A lone Comanche woman in such conditions could only have reached his cabin by desperation or fate. She was curled against the wood, seeking warmth, though barely conscious enough to hold herself upright. Elijah pulled her inside before thought could intervene. Snow clung to her hair, and her breaths were shallow. Her hands were stiff with cold, and her moccasins were soaked through. As he lowered her near the fire, the storm roared louder outside, as if sealing them within the cabin, leaving the two strangers alone in the middle of a merciless night. He worked with the practiced motions of a man who had lived too long in the wilderness. He removed the wet outer layers, wrapped her in blankets, placed her close to the fire, but not so near as to burn, and checked for signs of injury. She bore no wounds except for the cruel bite of winter. Though he did not speak aloud, a single unspoken truth settled between them. She had come to his door not out of chance, but out of sheer will, to survive. And in a land where survival often depended on unlikely alliances, her arrival marked the first time in 9 years that Elijah Crow's life would shift from solitude towards something neither he nor the wilderness had prepared for. Outside, the storm howled on, isolating the valley even further. Snow piled high, sealing the cabin in white. Inside, the fire cast a trembling glow across two lives that had collided in the heart of winter. For Elijah, it was the beginning of the end of living alone. For the woman, it was a fragile thread of hope in the coldest night of her life. And for the land itself, it was the quiet start of a story that would test loyalty, trust, survival, and the forgotten warmth of companionship. As the storm deepened and the night stretched long, the cabin held a silence that was no longer empty, a silence ready to shape the next chapter of their intertwined fate. The cabin stood half, buried beneath a heavy drift of snow by the time dawn arrived. The storm had not relented through the night, howling like a creature unleashed across the plains. When the first pale hints of morning filtered through the frost-covered window, the land outside had become a blank expanse, where even familiar shapes were lost to winter's stubborn grip. Only the muted glow of embers and the steady rise of smoke from the chimney suggested life remained in this forgotten corner of the wilderness. Inside, the warmth of the fire created a pocket of fragile safety. Elijah Crow, weary from a night spent tending to both flame and stranger, moved with deliberate care. He had long grown accustomed to waking alone, to hearing nothing but the crackle of burning wood and the shifting groans of the cabin walls. Yet now, for the first time in 9 quiet years, another presence occupied the small, weathered space. The Comanche woman lay wrapped in thick blankets near the hearth. The fire's steady heat had begun to restore color to her skin, thawing the harsh bite of frost that had crept into her limbs. Her breathing, shallow in the night, had become deeper and more measured. She remained unconscious, but there was life in her still, fragile but steady, like a flame that refuses to be snuffed out by the cold. Elijah busied himself with familiar tasks, though something in him felt unsteady, as if routine had been disrupted in a way he could not quite articulate. He prepared a simple meal, checked the state of the firewood, and stepped briefly to the window to inspect the aftermath of the storm. What he saw confirmed what he already suspected. The world outside had been swallowed whole. The door was barricaded by snow up to the latch, and the horizon was veiled in a white haze that made distance difficult to judge. Even if he wished to step outside, the storm had decided otherwise. The day would be spent indoors. That much was certain. The woman stirred slightly, shifting under the blankets. Her brow tightened as if wrestling with dreams or memories too heavy to hold. Elijah watched her for a moment, noting the signs of fever that often followed long exposure to winter. Her skin carried traces of frostbite, but not deep enough to claim fingers or toes. He had seen Frost's crueler work before, and the fact she still breathed meant she had fought fiercely to reach his door before the cold claimed her. Her clothing revealed much. She had traveled far, perhaps from a distant camp or across territory where danger lurked not only in nature but among men. Her moccasins were worn, the stitching frayed. The beaded patterns on her garments were those of a woman accustomed to movement, accustomed to resilience. But the exhaustion etched into her features told a story of recent hardship, of escape or desperation, and of a journey that required more courage than strength. Hours passed with slow patience. The storm had quieted, but the cold remained fierce. Elijah added more wood to the fire, filling the cabin with warmth that pushed back against winter's grip. The day grew long, marked only by the hiss of burning pine and the shifting of blankets as the woman's condition swayed between rest and fever. By late afternoon, she opened her eyes. There were no words exchanged, only the silent observation of two people who had lived separate lives until fate forced their paths together. Her eyes mirrored confusion at first, then recognition of safety, though her body remained weak and heavy. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing not fear but exhaustion shaped by long days of enduring the unforgiving land. Elijah tended to her without expectation. He offered water, warmth, and a space free from the storm's reach. She accepted what she could, her movements slow, her breaths shallow. She watched him with an expression caught between mistrust and necessity, the natural instinct of someone who had survived by relying on caution. Yet the cabin held no hostility, only the quiet acknowledgement that survival sometimes demands acceptance of unlikely shelter. As the light dimmed into evening, her strength waned again. Fever rose, her skin warming under the blankets despite the cold air that seeped through cracks in the cabin walls. Elijah remained nearby, feeding the fire, ensuring that warmth never faded. At intervals, he checked her condition, assessing the rise and fall of her chest, the flush across her cheeks, the restless movement of her hands. The storm's second night descended with a quietness far more unsettling than the previous night's roar. Snow no longer fell, but the world outside remained smothered beneath its weight. The valley lay silent, untouched, sealed in winter's relentless grasp. Elijah knew that even if the weather cleared, the journey to the nearest settlement would be treacherous. Events had unfolded in a way that forced him to stay put. with a stranger depending on him more than he had depended on anyone in nearly a decade. Yet something deeper stirred in him throughout that long night. Not sentiment, not desire, not anything shaped by longing, but a faint awareness that this shift in solitude was not temporary. The presence of another human one who needed warmth, protection, and time had unsettled the dust that had settled over his life. He had spent years living on the edge of the world, moving through days without expecting anything more than survival. But now, as he maintained the fire and guarded the fragile life lying near it, a sense of purpose crept back into his actions. Not a grand purpose, but something small, steady, and quietly persistent. The woman slept fitfully, caught in the hold of fever dreams. Her breaths, though uneven, continued with determination. She clutched the blankets as if anchoring herself to life, refusing to let winter drag her back toward death's quiet grip. Elijah remained awake through most of the night. His mind drifted to memories he had long kept buried, memories of another winter, another cabin, another life lost to a storm he could not fight. The recollection formed like frost on a window pane, fragile, cold, and haunting. For years he had shut out those memories by isolating himself from the world. But now, with a stranger battling for survival under his roof, the past pressed forward, reminding him of wounds never fully healed. The fire crackled as dawn approached, casting warm light across the woman's sleeping form. The fever appeared to ease slightly, her breathing less strained. Her strength was returning in small increments, like the slow thaw of frozen earth under the first sun of spring. Elijah watched her, knowing that the storm outside had changed more than just the landscape. It had forced two isolated lives into the same fragile shelter. What came next would no longer be shaped by routine or solitude. Their survival, and the story forming quietly between them, would depend on choices neither had yet spoken aloud, but both could feel settling into the cold winter air. Night faded, morning crept in, and the fragile link between cowboy and stranger began to tighten, preparing for the next turn in their journey. The third morning in the cabin arrived with an uneasy calm. The storm had finally passed, leaving the valley drowned beneath deep, unbroken snow. The sky above was clear, washed pale by the icy dawn, and the air held a stillness that clung to everything like a thin layer of frost. No birds moved across the horizon, no distant cattle called from far off ranges, no travelers rode the frozen plains. Only the faint rise of smoke from Elijah's chimney marked life within the vast white wilderness. Inside the cabin, the warmth remained steady. The fire crackled in a quiet rhythm, and the shadows it cast danced softly across the rough wooden walls. The Comanche woman lay where Elijah had tended to her over the past 2 nights, wrapped securely in blankets, her face carrying a color more natural than the feverish flush that had consumed her earlier. Though still weak, she was awake now, her gaze steady and far more observant than before. She studied her surroundings with the caution of someone who had survived many hardships. Every detail, the tools hung neatly by the door, the modest supplies arranged with care, the small table marked with years of wear, told her this was the home of a man who relied on order to keep the wilderness from swallowing him whole. Elijah, finishing the last of his morning tasks, moved about with the slow precision of habit. Even in the presence of another person, he kept his distance, not from fear, but from years of conditioning that taught him silence was easier than reaching outward. The woman watched him with quiet curiosity. There was no shared language between them, yet the absence of words created its own form of understanding. She noted the way he tended the fire first, ensuring warmth above all else. She watched him check the water he had melted from the snow, making sure it remained clean and usable. She saw how he glanced at her every so often, not intrusively, but with an unspoken awareness of responsibility, a kind of instinctive guardianship born from unexpected circumstance. Her strength returned slowly. She pushed herself upright with effort, leaning against the wall as she studied her own condition. Her clothing, now dry and draped neatly over a chair near the fire, bore the marks of harsh travel. She reached for the beaded pouch that had been placed beside her and traced her fingers over its surface, confirming that nothing precious had been lost in the storm. Whatever journey she had made before arriving at Elijah's cabin had clearly been significant and dangerous. Elijah offered her space, allowing her to regain her strength without pressure or intrusion. Yet he remained aware of her every movement, the instincts of survival reminding him that any stranger in the wilderness arrived with a story carved from hardship. Trust was a luxury that neither of them could afford hastily, but necessity had brought them together, and necessity would shape the fragile bond forming in the quiet cabin. Throughout the day, she rose from her place by the fire, testing her legs. She moved with care, each step deliberate, her balance uncertain but improving. She paused often to steady herself against the wall, and her breaths came short with the effort. Elijah stayed close enough to react if she faltered, but never close enough to invade her guarded space. He watched as she explored the small cabin, taking in its single shelf of belongings, the simple bed tucked near the corner, and the tools that revealed the life of a man who survived not by comfort, but by grit. The snow outside remained deep, pressing against the glass of the small window. When she approached it and brushed frost from the pane, she saw the world transformed into an endless white sea. There was no sign of her own people, no distant markers, no trail she could follow back. The realization settled on her features with a mixture of resignation and acceptance. The storm had not only trapped her in the valley, it had washed away every track that could have led her home. Elijah prepared a simple meal in the late afternoon, setting it out in a way that extended goodwill without expectation. The woman accepted the offering with the quiet dignity of someone who had long known how to survive on very little. She ate slowly, cautiously, conserving her strength. There was something in her posture, the way she sat straight, backed, the way her eyes remained alert despite exhaustion, that spoke of resilience forged in a harsh world. When night returned, it fell heavier and colder than the morning had implied. The temperature plummeted, and frost formed on the edges of the window faster than Elijah could brush it away. He reinforced the fire double, checked the shutters, and added layers of pelts for insulation. The cabin tightened against winter's advance, shrinking around its two occupants like a protective cocoon. The woman sat once more near the fire, wrapped securely in the blankets. Though she did not speak, her presence created a shift in the rhythm of the cabin. Elijah found himself listening differently, not simply to the cracking wood or the howling wind, but to the subtle sounds of shared space. Her breathing soft and steady, the faint rustle of her movements, the quiet strength she carried even while weakened. Both knew that this situation was temporary. The storm would eventually release its hold and paths would open again across the plains. But the wilderness had a way of binding people together in unexpected ways, especially when survival hinged on cooperation rather than separation. Later, as the fire dimmed and the cabin leaned into another long night, the woman finally allowed sleep to take her. Her body relaxed in a way it had not since arriving, the tension in her features easing beneath the warm glow of the fire. Elijah remained awake for a while longer, his thoughts drifting through memories he had spent years avoiding. He considered the strange turn of fate that had placed this woman in his path, a twist of winter that broke 9 years of solitude in a single desperate moment. He did not know her story yet, nor the dangers that might follow her. but her presence had shifted the silence of his world in a way that could not be undone. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb of old memories. Instead, it held an unfamiliar sense of possibility. Outside, the moon cast a pale silver reflection over the snow-covered valley. Inside, two lives rested beneath the same roof, bound by circumstance and the unforgiving winter. And as the cold deepened and the fire glowed faintly, the next chapter of their fragile, intertwined fate waited quietly beneath the surface of the long night ahead. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm, shaped by necessity and the delicate balance between two lives adjusting to shared space. The storm had broken, but winter remained entrenched in the valley, gripping the land with a cold that reached bone deep. Snow blanketed every ridge and hollow, muffling sound and movement until the world felt suspended in a fragile stillness. Only the distant echo of shifting ice or the groan of a frozen branch disturbed the silence. Inside Elijah's small cabin, the Comanche woman regained her strength in steady increments. The fever had finally lifted, leaving her clearer, eyed and more aware of her surroundings. She moved with greater confidence now, though every action remained measured and silent. The blankets no longer held her captive. She rose each morning, adjusting to the limited space, observing the patterns of this solitary man's survival. Her presence, though quiet, reshaped the life Elijah had built over 9 years of isolation. The routines that once defined his days now carried subtle extensions. When he prepared food, there was consideration for another portion. When he inspected his limited supplies, he took stock with an awareness of shared necessity. When he tended the fire, he ensured its warmth reached not only his corner of the cabin, but the space she occupied as well. Yet despite the slow easing of her condition, a tension lingered between them, one not born of distrust, but of unspoken histories. Both carried scars shaped by time and loss, and both understood that survival in the wilderness demanded caution even in moments of safety. The silence between them was not empty. It was layered with experiences neither could yet place into words. On the 4th morning since her arrival, Elijah stepped outside for the first time. The door, long pressed by snow, opened with effort. A wall of white greeted him, rising nearly to his shoulders. The valley beyond appeared untouched, a vast sheet of shimmering ice beneath the sun. His horse, sheltered beneath a crude lean-to, snorted softly as Elijah approached, shaking snow from its mane. He surveyed the horizon with eyes trained through years of reading the land. Tracks would have been erased by the storm, but he looked anyway, searching for any disturbance, broken branches, a shift in snow patterns, anything that hinted at movement. He knew the wilderness rarely delivered anything without a cost. The storm had brought the woman to his door. It could just as easily have carried something else behind her. Returning to the cabin, he brushed frost from his coat and entered to find her awake and preparing what little food remained. She moved with a discipline that spoke of a life lived close to nature, efficient, purposeful, always conserving energy. Though she had only regained partial strength, her instincts remained sharp. Elijah recognized the signs of someone who had survived long before reaching his door. Hours later, as the day stretched toward afternoon, she stepped outside for the first time since the storm. Elijah watched from the doorway as she breathed in the frigid air and examined the endless expanse of snow. Her eyes carried a distant weight, as if calculating the distance between her present circumstance and the world she had been separated from. She knelt briefly, touching the snow with her fingertips, then rose slowly, scanning the ridges and distant bluffs with a familiarity that only someone raised in open country possessed. It took only moments for Elijah to see the change in her posture. She stiffened, her gaze narrowing toward the far edge of the valley. The snow lay thick and pristine. Yet she had noticed something he had not, a disturbance so subtle it eluded untrained eyes. She stepped forward, studying the horizon with the focus of someone who sensed danger long before it appeared. Elijah followed her line of sight. At first, he saw nothing but the unbroken field of white and the jagged shapes of distant rock formations. But as the sun shifted behind thin clouds, faint impressions appeared, shadows stretched across the snow. They were not natural formations. They were shapes that moved, slow, deliberate, calculated, riders. Their silhouettes emerged gradually, like ghosts rising from the earth. A small group, but enough to bring trouble to anyone living alone in the wilderness. Their approach was cautious, as if searching for something, or someone hidden within the valley. They rode in a formation that suggested skill and experience. Men accustomed to tracking, men who understood the land. The Comanche woman remained still, her expression unchanged, but her breath sharpening with tension. Elijah recognized the meaning instantly. Whoever these riders were, they were not strangers to her. Whether they were allies or enemies was a question that carried weight, a question the land itself seemed to hold suspended in the quiet air. She stepped back inside the cabin with calm, purposeful movement. Elijah followed, closing the door quietly behind them. Though no words passed between them, understanding settled in the small space like a shift of wind before a coming storm. The riders were searching, and their arrival in this isolated valley was no coincidence. The woman gathered her belongings, few though they were, with the deliberate care of someone preparing for the possibility of flight or confrontation. Her movements revealed instinct born from experience. She had been running before the storm had forced her to seek warmth. Now the past she had outrun was approaching on horseback. Elijah checked his supplies, scanning the cabin for what little he had that might be needed. The land outside had changed from silent to watchful. The riders had stopped at the mouth of the valley, studying the terrain, their silhouettes poised against the stark horizon. They surveyed the snow-covered landscape with the confidence of hunters certain their quarry had not escaped. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the snow, deepening the sense of unease. The woman stood near the fire, her face calm, but her posture alert. Elijah sensed the weight of the moment, the thin veil of safety beginning to fray. Nightfall would bring its own challenges. The riders had seen the valley. They would not leave without searching it. The cabin, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now a beacon in the wilderness. The snow muffled every sound, yet the land felt poised on the edge of movement. The air grew colder. The fire flickered. Outside, the riders waited. Inside, two strangers prepared for the reality that the next day would change everything. Night descended slowly across the valley, pulling a curtain of cold darkness over the land. The snow, pale and unbroken beneath the fading twilight, reflected the last traces of daylight like a sheet of polished glass. The riders who had appeared on the horizon remained at the valley's edge, their figures steady and unmoving. They did not advance, yet they did not leave. They waited with the patience of men who understood the land and the creatures hiding within it. Inside the small cabin, the air thickened with unspoken tension. The Comanche woman moved carefully, adjusting her belongings, arranging them in a way that revealed her readiness to flee if needed. Though her strength had returned in part, she still carried the fatigue of her long journey, and her breaths came with traces of strain. She watched the window with unwavering focus. studying the shifting shadows cast by the moon on the snow. Elijah prepared the space with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to defending himself against the wilderness. He secured the shutters, tightened the latch on the door, and ensured the fire remained strong enough to keep the cold at bay without casting too bright a glow that might reveal unnecessary movement. He checked what few tools he possessed, none designed for danger, yet all usable if. He moved without sound, his face shaped by the seriousness of the night. Hours passed with the slow, grinding weight of uncertainty. The riders did not approach, but neither did they withdraw. Their presence pressed against the cabin walls like a haunting reminder that safety in the wilderness was always temporary. The wind rose in faint whispers, brushing against the snow and carrying the subtle groan of trees freezing under winter's grip. The woman remained seated near the fire, but her posture stayed alert, her back straight, her gaze constantly shifting between shadows. Her instincts, sharpened through a life lived close to the earth, warned that the rider's stillness was a calculated choice. They were waiting for darkness, waiting for the cold to weaken their quarry, waiting for the right moment to move unseen. The moon, half shrouded by thin clouds, cast a dim silver glow over the snow-covered valley. The light was enough to reveal movement near the far ridge. Elijah caught sight of it, first dark shapes breaking from the shadows, approaching the cabin at a slow, deliberate pace. There were more of them than before. The original riders had been a small group. These figures, creeping silently across the snow, marked an increase in numbers. The woman noticed them as well. She rose to her feet with care, bracing herself against the wall as a wave of tension surged through her. She understood immediately what this meant. The men searching the valley were determined. They had followed her across harsh terrain, through a deadly storm, and into this secluded refuge. Whatever she carried, whether knowledge, a history, or simply her presence, was of deep interest to them. The night deepened, and the figures drew closer, their movements blending with the land. The snow masked their footsteps, soaking sound until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elijah stood near the door, his posture still, but his senses heightened. The cabin had not seen visitors in 9 years. Now, danger circled it with predatory precision. The first disturbance arrived as a faint crunching sound, a subtle shift in the snow just beyond the window. It was followed by another, then another, spaced evenly as if testing the boundaries of the cabin's safety. The woman's eyes narrowed, tracking the presence she could not see but felt deeply. Elijah stepped closer to the fire, dimming it subtly to reduce the glow that leaked through the cracks in the wall. The footsteps grew more deliberate, circling the cabin in slow, measured arcs. The riders had dismounted. They were moving on foot now, preferring stealth over force. Their intention became unmistakably clear. They were searching for a sign, any sign that the woman they pursued had found shelter here. The cabin remained silent, holding its breath as the intruders moved about. The woman kept herself near the shadows, her face steady, even as tension rippled beneath the surface. Elijah's gaze flickered toward her briefly, measuring her resolve. Despite her weakened state, she bore the look of someone prepared to endure whatever the night demanded. Time stretched thin, the footsteps stopped, replaced by the slow scrape of gloved hands brushing against the wood of the cabin wall. Someone lingered near the door, testing the strength of the latch without making a sound. Another presence lingered near the window, casting a shifting silhouette across the thin frost that covered the glass. The woman remained still, her breath steady but tight. Elijah moved with controlled silence, retrieving a tool from the corner, more symbolic than practical as a means of defense, yet held with intention. The cabin, small and weather-worn, felt as though the slightest misstep would shatter the fragile quiet, keeping danger at bay. Eventually, after a long stretch of stillness, the intruders retreated from the immediate walls of the cabin. Their footsteps padded across the snow, gathering again near the ridge, forming indistinct shapes beneath the moonlight. They had not discovered the truth, but they had confirmed their suspicions. The valley held life. The woman sank back to a seated position, exhaustion washing over her as the strain of silent vigilance took its toll. Fire flickered with low embers, casting a faint glow that softened the cabin's harsh edges. Elijah remained standing for a while longer, unwilling to trust the retreat fully. Men determined enough to track someone this far rarely surrendered the hunt so easily. The night waned slowly, though sleep did not come for either occupant of the cabin. The woman rested with her eyes half closed, her mind still sharp beneath the exhaustion. Elijah kept a quiet watch, measuring every shift of shadow through the frost-lined window. As dawn finally stretched over the valley, the riders remained on the ridge, their silhouettes etched against the pale horizon. They had not left, they were waiting for the day to reveal what the night had hidden. Inside the cabin, the woman's posture straightened again. The time for hiding was nearing its end. Choices difficult and irreversible would need to be made. The snow glistened beneath the rising sun. The riders mounted their horses, and the fragile safety of the cabin, once a sanctuary built from solitude, now sat on the edge of becoming a battleground. The final stretch of winter settled over the plains like a heavy blanket, weighing down the sky with gray quiet and slow-moving winds. For many, it was a season of hardship and fear. For the cowboy and the Comanche woman who now shared his life beneath a single roof of rough, hewn timber, it marked something deeper, an unspoken turning point neither had fully prepared for, yet both had felt coming. The land itself seemed to sense it, holding its breath as though bracing for a story's end. Life on the homestead had grown into a steady rhythm, shaped by survival and softened by companionship. The cowboy, once a man hardened by years of silence, had developed a habit of rising early, tending to the horses, stacking the woodpile higher than ever before, and checking the traps lined along the river. But now, whenever he turned, he no longer faced the emptiness of yesterday. The woman was always nearby, moving through the days with a quiet strength, grinding corn she had gathered in the fall, mending worn blankets, or tracing shapes in the frost on the window, as though reading messages written in winter's breath. And yet, despite this growing comfort, something unspoken hovered between them, something born from the knowledge that they belonged to two different worlds. The cowboy tried to push that truth aside. He tried to believe that shared winters and shared firelight were strong enough to erase all boundaries carved by culture, history, and blood. But as the snow deepened, so did the understanding that no warmth could hold a person forever from the pull of where they came from. The woman's gaze often drifted eastward, toward a horizon the cowboy could not interpret. Sometimes she lingered at the doorway longer than usual before stepping inside. Sometimes she stood at the riverbank, running her fingers through the ice-glazed water, as though listening to voices carried beneath it. And though she said nothing that could explain those moments, the cowboy knew she was remembering her people. More than once, he had caught her holding the beadwork pouch she kept tucked safely beneath her sleeping furs. She would press the small object against her heart, as if drawing strength from the memories it held. A name rested in her eyes, though she never spoke it. A child she had lost, a husband taken by conflict, a village burned or scattered. Whatever the truth was, it lived behind her silence. As winter's final storms rolled across the plains, they brought with them a change neither could ignore. Tracks began appearing near the homestead, hoofprints, some small enough to belong to ponies ridden by Comanche scouts. Smoke rose from distant ridges at night, signaling movement. The cowboy had lived long enough in the region to recognize what it meant. The Comanche were traveling again, regrouping after months of cold, preparing for hunting seasons and the slow return of warmer skies. He knew what that meant for the woman in his cabin. She knew it too. Still, life continued, meals shared, chores done side by side, quiet evenings spent watching embers fade. But each passing day settled heavier upon them, as though the cabin's walls were quietly mocking the countdown to an inevitable farewell. When the thaw finally came, it did not announce itself loudly. It arrived in small, almost reluctant shifts, the drip of melting icicles, the softening of frozen earth beneath boot soles, the distant call of returning birds. The woman stood outside on the porch for long stretches, head tilted slightly, listening to the world reawaken. She could hear the land speaking to her in a language the cowboy would never understand, and though she tried to hide it, the call stirred something deep within her spirit. The day the riders appeared on the ridge was the moment everything changed. A small party of Comanche, wrapped in furs and guiding their ponies through the melting snow, approached slowly. They carried no raised weapons, no signs of hostility, only recognition. They saw the woman, and she saw them, and in that silent exchange the truth unfolded. They were from her band. Survivors, perhaps, family, perhaps. Whatever their connection, it ran deeper than anything she could have formed in 9 months within the cowboy's isolated cabin. The cowboy did not interfere. He stood inside the doorway of the cabin, watching her kneel in the snow as the riders dismounted. She touched their hands, examined their faces, and allowed herself the first open expression of relief he had ever seen from her. The sight hollowed his lungs. He had feared this moment, but he had long understood it would come. The riders waited patiently for her decision. They did not rush her. They did not urge her. They simply offered her the truth she had never spoken aloud, that she did not belong in this lonely homestead forever, that she had a place among her people still waiting for her to return. She turned to the cowboy, and for a long moment the world around them stood frozen in the thaw. Though no words passed between them, everything was understood. She was grateful, she was torn, but she was also called by blood, memory, and duty. The choice she made was one born from pain and love both. She returned to the cabin only long enough to gather the beadwork pouch and the shawl he had given her during the coldest night of the winter. She held the shawl for a moment longer than necessary, tracing the worn fabric with a tenderness the cowboy felt deep in his chest. When she stepped out again, she walked with steady steps toward the riders. She did not look back immediately. She mounted her pony, adjusting the draped shawl carefully, as though respecting a memory. At last, before turning away toward the open plains, she looked back at the cowboy. In her eyes was a silent farewell, one that carried gratitude for the warmth he had given her, and sorrow for the part of her heart that would remain with him even as she rode away. The riders moved off, their silhouettes shrinking against the rising sun. The cowboy remained in the doorway long after they had vanished into the distance. The cabin felt larger that day, emptier than it had ever been in all the 9 years he had lived alone. Her absence carved a space inside him that could never fully close. But even in his solitude, he knew this truth. She had brought him back to the world, pulled him from a life of silence, and reminded him that even a man hardened by loss could still be capable of warmth. The winter she arrived had changed him forever, and though she was gone, the memory of those months remained like a fire that would never fully die. As spring unfolded across the plains, the cowboy returned to his work, but now, Whenever he looked toward the ridge where the riders had appeared, a faint hope stirred in him. Perhaps someday paths would cross again. Perhaps the prairie, vast as it was, would allow two souls who once found warmth in each other to meet once more. For now, he simply carried on no longer the man who lived alone for 9 years, but the man who had once shared a winter with a Comanche woman who came begging for warmth, and who left having given him something far greater.